Okay, Sergio, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anya. Thank you, Altekin. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you. My name is Sergio Palense. I'm also part of the Emergency Committee for Java. I am from Guatemala. Currently I live in New York City, and I'm an anthropologist. I have worked with Maya communities in the borderlands between Chiapas and Guatemala, and have been a part of the steering committee of the ECR since like 1 year ago. And so basically this is our fourth semester that we have been organizing the reading sessions, the reading group from the ECR after the pandemic started. So we have been talking about situations such as like the women's movement within Rojava and Kurdish struggles as well, the history of state formation and violence also in the Middle East, and specifically in the regions of Turkey, of Syria and Iraq as well. And one of the things that we were thinking last semester is nowadays it is really important to think about the commonalities of two of the most important struggles, revolutionary struggles in the world nowadays. In that sense, the Maya Zapatistas from Chiapas and the Kurdish from Rojava. And at the same time, how can we understand these specificities to think Chiapas, to think Rojava, within a broader perspective of peoples that have been creating, struggling against state formations, both in Mesoamerica, that means Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, for example, but also in the Middle East and specifically in the region of Turkey and Syria. So how can we find some of the specificities of what is a revolution nowadays? How this knowledge might be helpful to portray a new idea of today's task, one of the situations that we are living right today during the pandemic. So in that sense, we're going to explore some of the historical commonalities, some of the historical situations that both movements share in that sense. For example, we're going to have 5 series of the Zapatista and the Kurdish struggles reading sessions. So this is the first one that is called, the whole series is called Zapatista and Kurdish Struggles, Rethinking Revolution Nowadays. So we have 5 different sessions during the next months until January 21st. So today is called Colonization in Central America and Kurdistan, in Mexico as well, of course. So in that sense, we're going to analyze some of the aspects related with the history of what is colonialism in each country. Is it the same in the 16th century or the 19th century, for example? So we're going to analyze some of these aspects. Then we're going to have our second session from 1 month, like in October the 22nd, which is going to be focused on communal mobilization in Chiapas and Bakur, but from the standpoint of grassroots religious practices. So how can we understand the importance of secularism, but also the importance of religion, of religious practices for people? So that is going to be an analysis, how to think revolution also from the religious experiences, both in Central America, in Chiapas, and also in Kurdistan. The third session is going to be about the emergence of the EZLN and the PKK guerrilla organizations in the 1978, 1983. So some of the similarities that they share as Vanguardism, but also some of the transformations that they had. The fourth session is going to be focused on this transformation, this important reconceptualization of revolution, which means going from Vanguardism to communal revolution. What is a communal revolution in that sense? What are some of the aspects that Zapatistas and Rojava struggles share with today in their interpretations? Also, what are some of the ethnic and gender changes that have been happening within the struggles? And finally, we're going to finish with Zapatista and Kurdish women's struggles. So the importance of how to reconceptualize revolution through women's struggle as well, how anti-capitalism is also women's struggle. So in that sense, we hope that that we have this collective discussion from different parts of the world. We're very happy to have you here, guys. And so we can continue, I think, Anya.
Yes, we usually do a round of introductions just to get each other a little bit more, but I think we are too many today. So it may be better to skip that step and to jump into conversation right away. We just wanted to make a note about stack. We'll do progressive stack, and we'll also try to limit how long every participant speaks if they go on for too long, because in the past we've had those moments when certain individuals would kind of monopolize the space without even realizing that. So don't be offended if it feels like you're going on too long and you talk too much. We'll just gently point that out, so to make sure it's a democratic space and everyone has a chance to participate. Okay, I'll take in. Anything else?
Oh, just to add, I am the keeper of stacks. So you know, you can put an asterisk in the chat. You can put the word stack in the chat, or you can use the raise hand button. It will be a little bit more difficult because I have to switch between two screens to see a physical hand going up. So it's better to use the electronic means, I think, in this case. Okay, with that, we can get started.
Yeah, no lecture. It's all yours.
So one of the ideas is, for example, what are some of the things that caught our attention during the readings of both texts? For example, Guillermo Gonfil Batalla about what is colonialism in Mesoamerica or Mexico, or what is or some of the similarities also with Kurdistan in that sense. Both a certain colonialism that started in the 16th century. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about that, or whatever you would like to share some of your thoughts on the readings.
Everyone's been shy. No, someone has to jump in.
Well, can I start then?
Yes.
Sure.
Hello, Anya. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Clarice. I'm based in Brazil. Me and Anya, we already know each other for some time. It's been a year. And I've been following you on ECR. And I've been a translator for Legarin magazine for quite some time now. And I would like to say that the text about the Mexican, about the colonization of Central America, it does represents a lot for me being a Brazilian, because it was the same process. It describes exactly what happened in Brazil, but it weren't the Spanish people who were here, but the Portuguese. But the process was quite similar, and we have lots of indigenous people here who are struggling. I wanted to note that, point out that what is going on in Brazil right now. It is quite resembles to me what the topic is, because indigenous people have been struggling to keep their lands in Brazil right now, and they were in the capital, Brasilia. They had a huge demonstration. I don't know if you heard about it, but they are really struggling to maintain their lands, because the Supreme Court is trying to vote on something called Marco Temporal, which is if the indigenous people were there or were in their lands, demarcated lands, until 1988, they could keep their lands. But other than that, if they don't, then they can be expelled at any time. So it's been rough for us right now here in Brazil, and I hope to hear and comprehend things from the Zapatistas and Rojava's struggles. They could contribute to our indigenous struggles here in Brazil. We have lots of ethnical and different peoples who live here and are struggling to have the culture and languages and everything maintained, and we are struggling for that. If you don't, if you're not familiarized with what's going on in Brazil, please take a look and support us as well. And that's it. Good to see you, Anya, and everyone.
Thank you, Clarice. I would like to invite everyone also, don't limit yourself just to the readings. If you don't have much to say about the readings, that's completely fine. Feel please free, just like Clarice did, just talk about your own experience. What are your thoughts about the colonization, either in our region in West Asia or here in the Western Hemisphere? What would you like to share? So please feel free to share anything else also.
There's one more thing I'd like to add, which is described in the Mexican text, is that actually myself, I have a surname which is because my father, he was a black man, so my family tree has got the name de Jesus, which means from Jesus person. And it was, I study linguistics and languages and literature at the university. I'm a graduate student, and this surname is scientifically proved to be the evangelization process here in Brazil. They wanted everyone to be Christians, so they wouldn't put African surnames or African names into children, so it passed on. So here I am with the name of Jesus. I'm Clarice of Jesus. So this is, it continues, it goes on. So it reached me from, we had slavery here from the blacks and black people and indigenous people for 300 years, such as Mexico as well. So this is a point that I wanted to make. It goes on to today.
Thank you, Clarice. Targol, you are next, and then Dave.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Targol. I'm calling in from Oakland, California. I'm originally from Iran, and I'll leave it at that for now. I just wanted to, I have a comment and then also a more general question to pose. Something that struck me about the two readings was I appreciated how each one tried to distinguish between the forms of domination that preceded the current form of colonial domination in each context, so that, you know, even though there were, you know, unequal dispersion of power and conflict, you know, before sort of state formations post World War I in the Middle East or West Asia, or however we want to talk about the region, and also how the European colonial intervention or conquest in Latin America marked a very different form of domination, which he kind of describes as there's a definitive line of essential superiority or inferiority, right? That distinguishes the kind of difference of form of domination that also translates into how the different kinds of production. That it actually affects what they produced, right? It also affects the church's influence into personal family lives. And so the contexts are, of course, really different. But what struck me was that there was that under the prior forms of domination, there was a certain level of autonomy, which is not at all to romanticize the anything prior, but just to say there was some level of autonomous governance despite other forms of subjugation. And now definitively we have something really different. So that's just a general comment I wanted to share. And I have a question which may or may not be appropriate, but I'm more active with the Zapatista movement right now. And I have been in and out with, I think I came to one of the early meetings of the Rojava Emergency Committee, but sort of fell out. But I'm not as up to date about sort of what Turkey, the Turkish government, how and in what way it's occupying right now Rojava. I don't know. I know that there were some like dubious negotiations between Russia and Assad and etc. But I don't know how it's playing out along the border. And if folks had updates, I would love to know if it's appropriate. And I don't want to take us away from anything else that others want to talk about. Thank you.
Okay. Dave, you are next, and then Meredith.
Hi, my name is Daniel Wisniewski. I am a student of political science from Wright State University of Dayton, Ohio. I'm an anarcho-communist. I have been, I'm also an organizer for the IWW. I have been involved in Rojava solidarity work for ECR for about like 2 years now. And what do I need to share about the reading? If somebody knows, do I need to share what I found like interesting about the reading, or can somebody?
Yeah.
I arrived late. Sorry, yes. I arrived kind of late. Sorry.
No. We normally do introductions. This time we didn't because there's too many of us. But if you have something to share about the readings, go ahead now.
Yeah. I would say really I found the readings to be very informative in the sense that really as before me, as they were saying precisely regards to various forms of domination, how it dictates like the precise form of like the mode of production. And it like dictates precisely like what items, like what commodities were produced. And how like they precisely it goes through like the evolution of the various forms of domination from pre-colonial to the early onset of colonialism up until the present, and kind of like a historical narrative. I found that very very useful. That's all I got. I completely agree with what she said. With what Comrade Targo said.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I might have not pronounced it properly. I actually said Dave, but no problem at all. You would have been after Meredith, so I will go back to Dave. Dave Lippman.
I always hear my name when people are just shouting, hey. Anyhow, tagging on to what Clarice was saying, it strikes me that if one of the important things that the Kurds in Rojava and the Zapatistas have in common is being based in indigenous communities, we have very important struggles in the United States and Canada. I'm in New York, so, but that are indigenous struggles and have allies, but are relatively powerless to actually, there have been a few victories, but it is such an uphill slog. And all over the world, there are groups like this. I can think of 2 or 3 in China that just don't have the power, can't carve out autonomous liberated zones, and yet are really all united in very common approaches. Some more than others in terms of their theory and practice of non-hierarchical struggles and so forth. I would be interested if someone wants to speak on what organizations there are internationally that unite many of these groups and could give a higher profile and a new way of thinking for those who are not so aware of it. I know many people who have no awareness, for example, of the municipalist movement, of the fierce cities, as they sometimes call them, that recently had an international conference, and that share a certain number of beliefs and approaches with the 2 main groups under discussion here. So I'd love to hear more about what's going on. Thank you.
Okay, regarding questions, we will keep taking notes of them and then get them answered later. So I will pass the word to Meredith. You are mute, Meredith.
Mute. Sorry, I'm not very good at this. I loved the reading about Mexico. I thought it was so interesting. And I know more about other parts of the world than I know about Latin America. So I started thinking about different national modes of colonialism and thinking about the British, which I know the most about. And I felt that the article about Kurdistan was better on Turkey than it was on the rest of Kurdistan. And I just wanted to say that one of the problems with Iraqi Kurdistan is that the British added a different style of colonialism to the ones that we've already looked at, which is their famous slogan of divide and rule. So, you know, whenever they got any place, they would try to pit one religion against another or one ethnic group against another. And when they got to Iraqi Kurdistan, they found that the tribes, which they had been hoping to use against each other, were pretty much gone. They weren't very active anymore. So they rebuilt them and imposed a tribal structure on Iraqi Kurdistan that was sort of ancient. And that's really part of the problem now. So you have 2 families that are parties, but they're also tribes and also phenomenally corrupt, you know, using up all the wealth in the country. So it's, again, a third model of colonialism I just wanted to bring up.
Thank you, Meredith. I would like to explain progressive stack one more time, getting some comments about that. Progressive stack means basically POC people, women, transgender people get priority. So when I'm following stack, I am trying to alternate genders. That's what I'm doing. So that's why I may appear to have skipped you, but I'm not skipping you. So next one would be Alex.
Sure. So I want to try to like self-limit and try to keep what I have to say short because, you know, just in the interest of what you just said. But there's 2 things that strike me as really interesting, just kind of across the board whenever I like approach this kind of material, which is like, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think that like the role of states and borders in particular, in terms of like what Meredith was just talking about in terms of like pitting people against each other, I think is like a really, it's a commonality between both like the Kurdish diaspora and the Mayan diaspora in modern day, just kind of like, you know, around Mesoamerica, Latin America, just all kinds of different places. And the way that like when you draw a border between these people, it just kind of like intrinsically separates them. And so now to take the Kurdish example, because that's what I'm more familiar with, like the way that Syrian Kurds and Iraqi Kurds have like are right next door to each other, but have like completely opposite forms of government. And then there's like Iranian Kurds who, want their own autonomous movement. And yeah, but then the second thing that I always notice is like something that Subcomandante Marcos was talking about in an interview once, which was like drawing on the way that like, I don't think that he was specifically talking about Rojava because Rojava didn't exist as a political entity yet. But the way that there's like so many commonalities between these systems, and these indigenous-led sort of like autonomous bottom-up democracies, is like it's almost too important to just carry one name. And I thought that was like a beautiful sentiment. I think that's something that I've been trying to practice in my own life, for what that's worth. But that is end of my spiel.
Thank you, Alex. Next person would be Benjamin.
Good evening. Am I off mute? Yes. I'm calling from unceded Mattapian Islands on the banks of the Powhatan River, known by us settlers as Richmond, Virginia. Largely consider myself a community organizer and working for epistemological change. And one thing that struck me about the readings is I was listening to a lecture by Karina Ocho from Mexico, and she was mentioning that at the time of the Zapatista uprising in '94, how the Mexican press reported that Guatemala was attacking Mexico. And part of it was that in the Mexican identity, there was no understanding that there continued to be an indigenous population in Mexico. So the only way that many of the people in the media could understand an indigenous uprising was to imagine that Guatemala had invaded Chiapas. And kind of chips into the thought with the whole notion of nation states and nation states as an identity, and both with the Kurdish, the Maya around the planet, lots of people being screwed over by the structure of imposed nation states and then national identities that provide the energy for them. And I just want to say, I'm so happy you guys are there, because in my space where I'm at, there's not that many people to hang out with on a Friday night and talk about things I love. So hope I learned something, but I'm also here just to vibe with cool souls that are being turned on to the same stuff in life that has brought me here. Bye.
Thank you. I don't have anybody else on the stack right now.
I'm sorry, there's Jake. Jake,
sorry.
It went.
I must have missed it.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, my name's Jake. I live outside Boston in a town called Cambridge, Mass. Part of Black Rose. I'm also a community organizer here. We're working on trying to create a communal agricultural, small economy in our city by setting up communal gardens and creating public spaces in people's yards or community centers wherever we can. And I didn't get to read many of these readings, so I apologize, but I have studied both movements closely. And I always find when I read about colonialism against indigenous societies, how important, I mentioned, communal agriculture, but just how important it is to the colonists to, take away communal practices, communal autonomy, and try to replace it with individual economics. And I think that that's been, really common across the globe wherever these colonial movements have occurred. And I love learning about the Zapatistas and folks in Rojava in particular, because they're defending and trying to bring back some of those practices that I think are really important and inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jake. I will take Colin next and then Ellen.
Okay.
All right. So I'm Colin.
I'm Isabel. There was two of us here.
Yeah. So I'm Colin's my girlfriend, Isabel.
Our camera doesn't work. I'm sorry, everybody.
I just wanted to say I'm really excited for this online seminar, but Isabel did have a thought she wanted to share.
Hi, like we said, we're from Alabama here in the United States. I'm actually, my family is from El Salvador, so I thought it was really neat that one of the readings, where one of the recommended readings mentioned El Salvador. But I just wanted to go back to what Clarice said earlier. I hope I pronounced your name right. About the indigenous struggle. My grandparents from my mother's and my father's side, I have one grandparent each that are indigenous from different indigenous communities. And growing up, I felt pride in like where, you know, where my parents and like their struggle, but I felt like around me there was just, they wanted to hide that identity, and they just kind of, felt defeated by like, society. And I think I'm really new to all of this, but specifically to Rojava, I knew about Chiapas, but I feel like it's really inspiring, and I hope that, different indigenous communities around the world see Rojava or Chiapas as like beacons of hope, and there will be more uprisings. But I just wanted to share that. I hope everybody has a good night or good day wherever you're from. Thank you for the space.
Thank you, Isabel. Next is Ellen.
Yeah, very briefly. Because of work I'm doing, I'm a teacher in theater, and I've been doing a lot of work with Indigenous scholars coming into my classroom, and we've been walking on the land, responding to landscape, and all of the really extraordinary wisdom that is coming from there makes me think, first of all, the connections between Mesoamerica and Rojava. I know a lot about Mesoamerica, less about Rojava, but I had not made the connection, and I'm so delighted. I can't tell you, this is brilliant. The notion of bottom-up democracies, and that these are all over. But I want to say something. There's a magnificent book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Do you know? It is a work of an indigenous, beautiful, but she makes a very strong point. I recommend this to everybody. She says, basically, indigenous means that you care about the land as if your children are going to be here to live on it. And I love that. And what I want to say about that is that indigenous, absolutely the connections, but what she is saying and what I'm learning is the notion of a common pot. What Debbie Bookchin will talk about with Murray, the idea of usufruct, stewardship, that we don't own or possess anything, but we share resources and we cultivate our connections to each other in the land. And to my mind, that is so that's one of the central things that I see connecting the Zapatista struggle with what's happening in Rojava, with in fact many places, and yes, the indigenous struggles in this country. Cultural erasure is horrific. I say that as a Jew. I feel very, very much we've been attacked in that way. I see that even more so with my Native American colleagues, and even more so. So what I'm trying to, I'll pull this together, I'm getting passionate. I think that I really love the idea of non-homogeneous spaces, that we're talking about people from different backgrounds. One of the things, again, I'm learning from the indigenous scholars talking to me and performers, that there were many, 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 many tribes. They worked together, they interacted, but the idea of a non-homogeneous open space, which is what the Levant could be, what Mesoamerica should be, what Rojava is, where we're developing relationships with the land and bottom-up democracy. I think, nation state, what a horror, but to work through, I think we're talking about decentralized community action all over the globe that is caring of each other and of the land and the common pot that we share, we don't possess. So that's my 2 minutes, but I love these readings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Next is Arthur.
Hey everybody, Arthur here. I also love the readings, and I wanted to share an observation that I had, kind of like differences and also kind of analogs between the two contexts in the readings. And one was that, interestingly enough, like thinking about them side by side, it seemed like for Kurds within the Ottoman Empire, their experience, which carried out like into a late, like almost into the modern era, was almost more analogous in some ways, it seemed to me, to like the pre-colonial experience of indigenous peoples in Latin America in their relation to the sort of pre-existing empires that existed, right? So like the author of the piece on Mexico Profundo sort of talks about how, you know, there were existing forms of domination, sort of territorial domination, but within those forms, which you could call like kind of empires, like by the Aztecs, kind of communities on the periphery of those empires did exercise a degree of autonomy, both culturally and territorially. And that was like a really important distinction that he makes between like the form of colonization that came. And to me, that makes me think more of like the Ottoman Empire, where there was certainly a form of domination and imperial hierarchy, but it was not one which was trying to sort of deny Kurdish identity and eliminate the language, for example. And it seemed like Kurds within the Ottoman Empire went almost like straight rapidly to that state formation phase, which then entrenched this kind of like marginalization, whereas indigenous peoples in Latin America kind of went through this whole different form of like a colonial period, which brought with it unique forms of exploitation. But all that being said, I'm also seeing like the analogs where ultimately it is that process of nation state formation which solidifies those forms of oppression and kind of lays the ultimate groundwork for the sphere of struggle, which, you know, brought to life both of these revolutionary movements. And how interesting is it that eventually both of these movements, through their own practice of struggle, ended up coming to the conclusion that the state itself, the nation state itself, is a like root source of their oppression, which has to be eliminated or transcended in some way through communal autonomy in order to achieve true, you know, liberation. So I'm gonna stop my rant there, but really enjoyed it and excited to be here.
Thank you, Arthur. Islam, you are next.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just gonna, I mean, the readings are great. There's so much to discuss. I'm just gonna say maybe something with, you know, about Arthur's point about the Ottoman Empire, because obviously the reading we did on the Kurds and the you know, I mean, the discussion of Ottoman Empire there, usually, and this is something that's, I think, personally and politically important, because there is a romanticized version of how Ottoman Empire was one that kind of allowed diversity, which is actually not true, but it's so much shared among the Ottoman historians and academics that Ottoman Empire was a, you know, I mean, okay, I'm gonna keep this short. So I think what maybe we can at least recognize in terms of the Ottoman Empire and why it seemed to kind of provide this more freer space for Kurds is something that the other reading discusses, that religion becomes a very important factor in colonization in, you know, in the other parts. So which means Kurds to some extent shared some religious affinity with the majority Ottoman rule to some extent, even though, you know, they had periods of massacres as well. But Ottoman Empire was very violent, especially against the religious minorities. So something, you know, then I'm glad Sergio mentioned that we will discuss the role of religion in all of this, which I think maybe we can discuss this further there. So just, you know, just to mention that there is some commonalities that the empires used and associated and or gave some space for Kurds to practice, as opposed to, for example, in numerous like Alevi massacres, religious minority massacres under the Ottoman Empire. And especially increasing with the centralization, Kurds become targets as well. That, you know, obviously we couldn't read so much, and so readings make some generalizations. Just wanted to say that let's try to watch out for the romantic interpretation and presentation of Ottoman Empire in these like academic
interpretations of Turkish history. Thank you.
Thank you, Islam. We have Elif first and then Anya.
Let me take this down here. Okay. Yeah, I just want to build off on that because I think Islam made a really a great point, as well as Arthur. I mean, just because certainly Mesoamerica and then the structure that was in place that was spoken about in the readings, I'm by far I'm very ignorant of this topic. I don't want to speak to it in terms of the Aztec empires or anything like that. But I think there was a lot more similarities in terms of structure or politics, as opposed to what was going on necessarily with the Ottomans and then the Kurdish tribes. I mean, for those of you familiar with the history, I mean, I want to keep this short, but the Ottoman Empire is notorious for pitting different Kurdish tribes against each other constantly and constantly having them warring so that they wouldn't even consider the idea of autonomy. I mean, the Kurdish tribes were always seen as some kind of threat to them, and then to try and control them and conform them. And these are like the Muslim Aga, warring tribes, never mind the religious minorities that Islam was talking about, like Alevis and such. So I think that we want to, I know there is a tendency, especially right now in these kind of post-colonial or decolonial spaces, to kind of romanticize some of these, pre-state formation empires, but there is still quite a huge power structure. I mean, a power disparage between what the Ottoman Empire was doing and then and how the Kurds were in relation to that. I mean, they were controlling them, in many different ways. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elif. Anya, you're next.
Okay, so I was the one who chose that reading. My apologies, but it's oftentimes hard. It's been hard for us to match readings for Central America and Middle East, specifically Kurdish context. Thank you. Because I think there's some, several of you have pointed out there are just differences in the forms of exploitation and extraction of wealth, right? The colonial or imperial. So I chose that article because I think it's important to see the role of the European imperial powers in that moment when there was a shift, right? The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and then the creation of the nation states. I think there we have a connection, right? So it's not the original developments, the development that was shaped by the world imperial system. Although we are looking at basically two different moments. One is the earlier in the 16th century, right? 15th, 16th century, and one is later. But we still have the same European imperial powers using different forms of oppression, exploitation. Another point was that I think when Sergio started out, the focus was on exploitation of labor in Central America with the after the conquest, right? So that was a major aspect, and we couldn't find that in the Kurdish context. So in the Kurdish context, it seemed, following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire with the creation of the Turkish nation state, it seemed more about the control of the territory rather than necessarily directly exploiting the Kurdish population that became part of the Turkish state. And for the imperial powers, it was for Britain and France who received mandates for the Kurdish Kurdish population that was part of Iraq and Syria. So there it was more of control, of natural resources and geopolitical interests. So there were these two dissonances that we had to deal with. Just wanted to point out because for me it's interesting. I think both stories are stories of capitalism, but it's not just colonialism. I think it's a colonialism that has been part and parcel of the capitalist development, but we are observing different forms of exploitation, extraction of value, either through resources or through labor plus resources, which is more explicit in that moment when we're looking at the Mesoamerica.
Thank you, Anya. I don't see any other hands. Anybody else right now? So I would like to share a couple of words. We talked about colonialists dividing and controlling us that way. That's basically a strategy they have used in all of our spaces. And that's, I think, one of the things I would say about myself is I am definitely a very militant internationalist. I'm not tied to any nation state. I reject nation states. I hate nation states. And I think that's a very important point for us as we move forward to open our minds to this and move away from what they are trying to do to us, because this comes from the Roman Empire, divide et impera, which is usually translated as divide and conquer. But that word actually means rule, to reign, to rule in English. So that's how they rule over us. And when we talk about autonomous government and autonomy, the Greek root, also nomos means also to rule. And that comes from the same root, self-rule. We are ruling ourselves. We don't have any rulers above us. And that's basically when we talk about autonomous governments, that's what we are talking about, in my opinion. So that's the point how I am usually seeing these things. When we say another world is possible, for me, that world would be people ruling themselves and not having rulers above them, exerting power, exploiting them. So, and I think I see this similarity between both movements, both in Rojava and also the Zapatista movement. And that's for me a big commonality we should focus on also as we are working and living together. Okay, next Meredith, and then Ariella.
I'm trying to figure out how to put this. Okay.
Unmute, now you're muted. Go back.
Click it again, Meredith.
Got it. I'm sorry. Anyway, I wanted to go back to religion because one of the things that struck me most about the reading about Mexico was that, and this is very similar to what I know about Africa, that the church comes in and it's a united church and they strip the culture, they strip the communal relations, they strip the land, they strip the property, they strip the labor from everyone who is already there. And they say, in exchange, we are giving you God. And you must cleave only to God and not care about anything else. And, religion can have positive aspects, but the way it is being used today is very similar to this, to organize, people to the point that they become completely crazy, at least in the United States, and think that their religion is so important that they should just trample on everybody else. I'm done.
Thank you, Meredith. Ariella?
Yeah, I thought the readings were both really interesting, and a point that stood out to me in both of them was like the formation of identity under, a capitalist, colonialist, oppressive regime, especially what it means for, in Mexico and Chiapas, like what it means to be Indian or indigenous, and then in Turkey, what it means to be Kurdish, and how that there's been moves to reclaim these identities in a more emancipatory way. I just thought that was really interesting.
Thank you. Clarice, you're next.
Well, sorry, I was about to say about religion too. I'm also going to speak from Brazilian perspective. We are the greatest, largest Christian country in the world. So you can see how they forced us force the origin people who are here to be Catholics at most. So we have this going on forever, and I really look up at Rojava and also the Zapatistas and also the text when they mention that the Aztecas and the Mayas, they were okay with people bringing their religion on and their culture differences. This really touched me because it's really, they kept their enemies. They were okay with their religions and their differences. And this is so, this is something that attracts me both in Rojava and the Zapatistas, because Rojava has lots of ethnical diversity, and I can see it. I always bring this reflection, these thoughts on Brazil, because we have so many different religions, other than we are thought to be like a monolinguistic country, but we are not. We have like 123 languages going on, and we have no idea as Brazilians. So what are you missing? So what kind of cultures are we missing as Brazilians? In general, we just don't know. We just ignore them. And the indigenous people are the ones, I must quote this, I must speak about this. They are the ones that are saving the forest. They are the ones, we are going through hydrical crisis. And if we don't save the indigenous, help them out and speak about them, we are going to lose. The rainforest is being increasingly burned and destroyed over companies and everything. So this discussion over Rojava and the Zapatistas and over the colonization process is very enriching to me. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands. Just for clarification, I was just texting with Anya about the time, because we announced this is between 6:30 and 7:30. We will go to 8:30. So it's 2 hours, not just 1 hour. So please keep talking. Okay, Sergio.
Yes, so thank you, Altekin. So two things I wanted to say related with both readings. I found very important to see like the development of two different colonial aspects of the forms of domination in that sense. And also how, for example, there are two historical moments that are fundamental to understand the two struggles, Mesoamerican and also Kurdistan. The first one would be by mid-16th century, which is really interesting, the expansion of Ottoman Empire towards the westward part of like Iraq and also Anatolia, like present-day Anatolia, and also about the conquest, the invasion of the Spaniards in what is today, for example, Mexico and Central America. Now, an important aspect in this sense, when we think about the Zapatistas, they live in Chiapas. Chiapas is the southernmost Mexican state in that sense. But originally, between the 16th century and 1821, Chiapas was part of the colonial regime of Guatemala. So it was like the kingdom of Guatemala. When we think about, for example, Mexico Profundo, which is the reading that we have by Bonfil Batalla, it is interesting how Mexican revolutionary nationalism built from the 1910s, 1920s, it has built the idea of Mexico as almost the entire of Mesoamerica. And even Zapatismo as well reproduces some of these kind of reflections about Mexico. So it is important in that sense. For example, Isabel and Colin, they were talking about El Salvador, for example, to know the struggles that were happening, not only from Chiapas to Mexico, because that would be the idea of identifying, for example, Zapatista only with Mexico, but with a broader process of indigenous communities, and many of them Maya communities in the regions of Yucatan, Chiapas, Guatemala, El Salvador, for example, or Honduras. And in that sense, The third reading that we had for today that was an optional, it was basically all this communal movement in the west part of El Salvador, which is called Aguachapan. So this was one of the first like indigenous and communist rebellions in the history of the Americas in 1928, 1932 as a process. And it was also one of the first genocide acts in the 20th century in the Americas. More than 30,000 people, that is one of the figures that we have, they were killed during 1 week. And if we think about the Paris Commune in 1871, it is a similar figure, about between 10,000 and 30,000 people killed by the governments. So why do we, like in the left history, we don't find like this important aspect of El Salvador, not only related with the FMLN in the 1980s, but also in the 1932 rebellion, and how the history of the 1932 rebellion in indigenous El Salvador is so connected with the experiences of the Zapatistas later on. So in that sense, these reading sessions try to show like the broader perspectives of how people from below, they share certain aspects of fighting, for example, in the case of Mesoamerica, against plantations, for example, coffee plantations, banana plantations, sugarcane plantations, which is different from an oil-centered state or nation state in Kurdistan or in the Middle East. So these two important aspects of how to differentiate both the expansion of capitalism and at the same time that, as Meredith was saying and pointing out, colonialism is very different from each region. British colonialism and Spanish colonialism from the 16th century has different nuances, but I think we're gonna have enough time to reflect about this during the next sessions. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sergio.
See a hand.
Okay, Michael.
Okay, you see it too, great.
Hi. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, great. I wanted to directly respond to Sergio. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I think one of the issues I've been reading a lot about from the work of Masiliamo Tomba's work on Marxist temporalities. And one of the things that he brings up that's been brought up by a lot of people, Walter Benjamin and Maria Tege in Peru, is that we're looking at different temporalities when we look at colonialism. And this is, and capitalism, right? And so if we were to begin to see that the way in which capitalism basically attempts to synchronize these other forms of production and kind of get other, you know, whether it's through extraction, financialization of extraction, whether it's through forced labor, war, various forms. These modes of production, they exist and continue to operate underneath the surface as though they're strata of, if you kind of look through geological time, right? If you were going to go down further and you can see, well, underneath, you know, what the Maya people have been doing for many hundreds, maybe thousands of years, have been a mode of production that then can potentially leap into a revolutionary space. And so we need to be aware of this when we begin to understand these emergent movements, that they're not something that they just come out of a reaction to, you know, like NAFTA or something, right? This is something that happens over a course of time because the culture, the larger society, the connection with the ecology, these are things that have been going on, percolating underneath the hegemonic rule, right? This is the same thing in Kurdistan. And thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Daniel, you are next.
I would just like to just echo what Sergio was saying. I agree completely. What was this? The one who just the individual fellow who just spoke before me. Yes, I mean it elaborates very well, I think, on like the various modes of domination precisely, and which essentially compels the population, like the subjugated population, the native population to submission. Sorry, I don't have any more. I just want to say I completely agree with that. I didn't know I didn't have my hand raised, so I just wanted to let Benjamin speak because he had his hand raised. Thank you.
Benjamin, you are next.
Yeah, Michael, I totally dug what you said. And something that trips me out to think about is like how in Europe in the feudal times, you had a sort of norm where when there was conflict between royal families, they didn't mess with the peasants because they needed the peasants to produce. And my study, like in Guatemala, my wife is from San Marcos, but she pertains to an identity group, Campesino. And it's a very interesting identity group in a particular region that she's in, and that it blends both indigenous communities and what would be referred to as Ladino communities. But they have a overarching identity of unity as Campesino, the same with, como in Central America and La Costa, you have the Costeño identity, in Nicaragua, Honduras, which is an anti-Hispanic, anti-dominant society culture. You could say an identity of opposition, oppositional identity. And thinking about prefigurative politics on how we contest the power of the nation state. One thing is to look at historically in Mesoamerica. I mean, one of the strengths of Maya culture was that peasant culture that existed outside of the different royal structures, royal families, that enabled a form of cultural survival after imperial conquest, after colonization. So getting to like United States with IWW organizing, CIO organizing, whole union organizing, how do we, engaging in prefigurative politics, thinking about identities of opposition, how do we tap into something that's not glorifying high culture or parties at the Met, and instead identifying Campesino culture that we all share globally, una cultura campesina en oposición a la oligarquía. I can only say it in Spanish because I don't know why I feel it in Spanish. It's hard. I guess English is such a harsh language. It's hard to get the vibe going in English.
Thank you, Benjamin. Elif, you are next.
Yeah, I wanted to just build off of this, like really, and I mean, in terms of the reading as well, or at least like what I was able to gather from it in terms of this understanding of like when the creation of the colonized subject came about. And I know we were talking about like mode of production and its extract of resources. And like certainly in the case of Mesoamerica, or that period, precisely about temporalities, like we're talking about 16th century, like so long ago, as comparatively to when, like I think that there's some use in us understanding what we understand as capitalism or neoliberalism, or both of these moments coming into, at least in this case, like Bakur or Turkey or the Kurdish part of Turkey. And I don't want to speak about Iran, Iraq, or Syria because they have their own relationship to capitalism and their own relationship to neoliberalism. But this much I know about the Ottoman Empire, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people in this room who know far more than I do about it. But there was a massive reformation right about the turn of the 20th century, even before that, where they went from, and in terms of land reformation, and if I'm not mistaken, there was like a system called Ayan before that was much more like the Ottoman, kind of a very feudal system. But then it got to the point where they had this reformation, they had Tanzimat, they had this kind of, reformation. Anyway, and this period is so critical to understanding when capitalism began in Ottoman Empire in Turkey. It predates actually the state. And I'm not saying that the Tanzimat reform had a lot of impact necessarily on Kurds in Iran or Iraq or Syria, or at those times those didn't even exist. But at the same time, that formation of and then capitalism, and then but just very quickly also with neoliberalism, because I think neoliberalism, especially in Kurdistan, in Turkey, really was such a pinnacle point where there was resource extraction, and this coincides with kind of some of the most oppressive periods. So I don't know, I just think that idea of the temporal, we don't have to come out of this thinking that, oh, okay, they're so similar or anything like that. It's so incredible just to sort of build off of each of these movements and these struggles, and seeing how the colonized subject vis-a-vis like capitalism or neoliberalism has come out of these struggles, I guess. Thanks.
Anya?
Just to briefly respond to what Elif just said, we had a series of reading groups previously on political economy of Kurdistan, and as we were gathering materials, we realized that especially this early period from shift from Ottoman Empire, like the late period of the Ottoman Empire into the formation of Turkish nation state, we couldn't find a lot of readings that would frame that from a perspective of capitalism, right? How capitalism, how it was a period of incorporation of the Ottoman Empire into a capitalist world system, right? And in which way the European capitalist powers were encroaching and using the minorities, non-Muslim minorities within the Ottoman Empire, right? And this article goes a bit into that, especially with the Armenians. But yeah, that has been a challenge, that while it may be framed as an moment, it's not often framed as a capitalist moment, at least explicitly. And that's a challenge when we try to look at both regions. Although I guess with the history of Central America, and Sergio, you would know better. Is that an accepted fact that for Central America, capitalism started in the 16th century? For me, since I'm being trained by world systems theory, that's I take it for granted now, but I don't know if that's the accepted fact in the historiography yet.
I don't see any other hands right now. Islam.
Well, I think just again, it would have been great to have more readings on that topic, and there isn't. It's not that you couldn't pick, there isn't that many. We tried one. There's one book, Anya, maybe you would want to put in case people are interested, in the chat, that we discussed before about that period, and Ottoman centralization and Ottoman Empire's introduction to capitalism, and how the Kurdish political economy was influenced by that period. So, but I think one of the important things maybe is that one of these empires do fail, right? So despite its state centralization efforts, despite all that they try in the 18th and 19th centuries, and everybody knows, good research shows that, in Mesoamerica, in other parts of the world, even prior to global capitalism setting in place, there was the war capitalism and colonial forms of war capitalism that led to this early emergence of capitalism, and that led to different forms of oppression and exploitation of the people. And so people resisted in forms that, to respond to their exploitation and oppression. So in the case of Kurdistan and Ottoman Empire, widely speaking, there is an introduction, there is a trial of privatization of land, for example, smaller extent, but there hasn't been like the earlier era of war capitalism. It was still plunder and different forms of getting resources, but not a steady formation of labor and land extraction from the people. And so there are, and I think maybe we should also recognize what Sergio was saying earlier, that, to see the parallels and commonalities and people's resistances, but to also see that at times they do suffer from different forms of oppression, and sometimes exploitation becomes much more relevant in one case as opposed to like political oppression. So for example, I mean, one of the massacres I studied, since it's so close to what Sergio referred to, in 1932, and one of the genocides in Turkish history against the Kurds, and in this case Alevi Kurds, religious different minority as well, was the Dersim massacres. And so if you see in one of the cases that they try to appropriate the land and make people work on the land as laborers, but in the case of the Dersim massacres, they try to banish this land so no one lives on it. So it's mountainous. It's not, also the geography itself, it wasn't suitable for agriculture. So instead it's better to get the Kurdish workers and have them forced migrate so that they become peasants in other parts of Anatolia. So the dynamics, I mean, there are definitely dynamics of exploitation, but the political oppression until a certain time, and until very late compared to the history of South America, is political oppression is much more visible, though equally cruel, against the Kurds, I'd say.
Thank you, Islam. Anybody else? Actually, one of the very important things which Emiliano Zapata said was tierra y libertad. So I think that's extremely important. Land, right to own land. I also know a little bit about the ejidos in Mexico, and also the partial land reform they have done after the revolution, 1910. And if you will look on the other side to the Ottoman Empire, in the earlier days of the Ottoman Empire, there was no true private property of land in the sense as we understand it under the capitalist system. We had a feudal system, even a tribal system. The tribe as a microstate, or the state like the Seljuk Empire or the Ottoman Empire, owned the land. It wasn't owned by individual peoples at that time necessarily. They used the land. They owned the land in terms of a user of the land, which is completely different than, having private property of the land. And I think there are some differences there. I'm by all means not a scholar in any of these, but just, talking out of what I know in memory. So, and in the meantime, we have some hands up.
Sorry, I'm going to intervene. I think Arthur was first. He put the stack in the chat.
I saw Arthur, thank you. Arthur, Daniel, and then Michael.
Oh, thanks, y'all. Yeah, no worries about the order. I just wanted to point out kind of one small analog that was really striking to me that I hadn't thought about in comparing these movements was that, and they come from different circumstances, right? But the fact that in both cases, the kind of colonized communities ended up in like geographically marginalized places, and which both happen to be like somewhat mountainous terrain, not necessarily arable land or prime arable land. And In both cases, that ended up actually overlapping with like historical territory of those peoples. I think Bonfil Batalla alludes to the fact that in the case of Chiapas, at least, some of that was actually the result of indigenous communities being like forced into like quote unquote uninhabitable or less inhabitable terrain in order to maintain some of their like sense of identity and autonomy. But then like in trying to think about what are the connections from understanding like this history of colonization to like in what ways did it also build in the forms of struggle and resistance, and so thinking about that like sort of positionality, you can see how later on those circumstances became sort of like strengths of the movement. I think like especially in the case of like Chiapas, the kind of militants that founded the movement were using this like ideology of folkismo, like from Che Guevara, that like ended up actually lining up really well with the conditions there. In fact, I even think that it was like chosen by those like militants from the city for those reasons. And then in Kurdistan, you can see how like the form that the guerrilla struggle took. The mountains were a place where not only were like the historical territory of the Kurdish people, a sort of like cultural stronghold, but also just like tactically, if you will, ended up providing a space where the movement could develop itself. And I think that's interesting, and I really look forward to kind of seeing that through as these sessions progress, and the history progresses, and seeing how this history continues through as a thread into the kind of more revolutionary stages that it ended up taking.
Thank you, Arthur. Daniel, you are next.
I just have a question for I believe whoever picked the readings, Anya. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but what was the role in the precise structures of domination as they were constituted by the state in precisely these societies? Was there like a particularly like a racial component like involved like in and like the struggle in El Salvador or like in like Latin America, precisely like how like in many cases with like many colonialist experiments, there's instances in which historical precedents in which the colonial oppressor, they like impose like an artificial identity, like an artificial racial identity, like upon the subjugated people. Precisely, I mean, maybe I missed something in the reading. Did it elaborate on like precisely the role of that? Yeah. Sorry, I'll let whoever answer that question.
Sergio, do you want to handle that? At least on Central America.
Yeah. Sorry, my question, just to make it short, is what is the role of the construction of race in like the colonialist in the construction of colonialist structures, like colonial state structures? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and then David.
Well, I just think first was there a response from Sergio or Anya in relation to his question, to Daniel's question?
Yeah, Sergio, that was a question for us. Since I mean,
sorry.
Arthur, you are also contributed the reading. Sergio, did you get the question? The role of race in the construction of identity.
Yes, so that is one important aspect in the difference of how the system, the colonial systems, call people or name people. In the Americas, it was the idea of the Indio, the Indian, which is quite different when we think about Turkish colonialism or Ottoman colonialism in Middle East. And in that sense, when we think about the Indio, it's a category built upon a genocide in the 16th century. And it's always recurring to a genocide that is potentially there. So when we think about 1932, like rebellion in El Salvador, it is also how the Salvadorian planter regime, which is very important when we think about racism in Chiapas, in El Salvador, or Guatemala, for example, we also think about a plantation. So planter, the idea of this colonial landlord that expects that that the Indian is always subordinated, that doesn't speak up, for example. It is always like a continuity in the Guatemalan, Salvadorian, or like states, and also in Chiapas. And in that sense, when we think about racism, it is both like a combination of this Spanish colonialist tradition, but also of the 19th century ideas of European biologism that came from the US as well. So we find this relationship between the US slavery in the South, for example, and the expansion of, for example, Chiquita Banana or the United Fruit Company in the 1940s, 1950s, or in that sense, since 1910, for example. So the idea of race is utterly related with plantation and with the colonial practice of defining people as indios. So, and it is not, it is not something that it is not often related. The Zapatistas started to organize around 1983 in Chiapas, in the same moment that at least 100,000 Guatemalan Indians were crossing the border, like fleeing from the genocide. So that is important to think how the Zapatista rebellion carries on this hidden tradition of the indigenous rebellion from the border side, for example, in Guatemala.
I'm gonna try to put Özlem on the spot because I'm not. I know there was also a racializing discourse against Kurds in the beginning of the 20th century, but I don't think I know enough. Özlem, are you there? I think you deal with that to a degree in your book. Okay, maybe Özlem will come back. Okay.
What are we doing? I'm confused.
It's Michael. It's for Michael right now, I think.
Okay. Before we continue, I would like to clarify the question of questions because we had some questions at the beginning and we had decided to put the questions at the end. I think we didn't clarify that in the flow at the beginning. I'm sorry about that. Shall we handle questions now or should we continue talking?
I would suggest that continue talking. Like, I don't know,
okay.
That would be.
Because we have a couple more questions which are still waiting to be answered. Michael, you are next.
Well, I just wanted to respond. I think something that Anya brought up earlier about capitalism in Kurdistan and within that whole region. Capitalism, as it emerges from the 15th century onward, has always functioned through two axioms. One is exploitation and one has been dispossession. And both of those overlap in various ways and upset the various regions and what they're doing as they are, begin to operate within. So, we can see perhaps the capitalist moment in some ways beginning in, with the partition of Kurdistan in World War I between the various nation states, the attempt to force assimilation upon Kurdish people, other people within those particular nation states, the displacement that occurs in relation to some of that dispossession. But also we see resistances happening throughout this time, particularly since the forming of the PKK, but even, even before that, in which people continue to create and produce along communal lines of production and reproduction. And so, you know, you can see this now with the attempt by the Turkish state to, you know, create these extremely destructive ecological dams that create water scarcity in Kurdish areas. And we can see the way in which many Kurdish communities have attempted to deal with that by, you know, Huseke, is that how it's, maybe I'm pronouncing, they attempt to reconnect to water within the areas because of the water scarcity. You know, you can see this conflict between modes of production of industrial agriculture going in and, you know, stealing basically olives from Afrin areas, and then the resistance emerging of Kurdish communities creating you know, other agroecological forms of production of food. I mean, this is all taking place in the midst of war and genocide. And so I just have to say that these modes of production that are alternative modes, and, you know, as Apple says, alternative modernity, democratic modernity that challenges the capital mode. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. David, you are next.
Yeah, thank you. And I have a word of appreciation. I'm learning so much today, and I'm so happy I found you, and look forward to continue with the reading. But there was one observation that I found really interesting, and the idea of how these various indigenous groups all seem to be situated primarily in the mountains. I know in Rojava and in Chiapas as well. And I'm also brought to mind more recently what's happening in Burma. There is a long tradition of struggle with the indigenous people who survived by retreating, or maybe not retreating, that was their home, where they lived in the mountains, and until very recent history could always evade whatever monarch or warlord or general wanted to capture them for taxes or slave or labor or whatever. And that the struggle that's going on there right now may have begun in the larger cities, but as the military has clamped down on what's happening in the cities, including occupying hospitals and so forth, the insurgents, if you will, or the dissidents, which are largely students, some doctors, a few military are retreating, I'm understanding, are heading into the indigenous areas that have a long tradition of avoiding being brought into the main part of the country and the culture. And they are training, what I understand from my reading, there's a militia of about 100,000 people now, which has happened like in 7 months. But at any rate, the point that originally came to mind was these mountainous people are the holders of great examples of our past, our present, and I'm thinking more and more our future as well. And thank you once again. This has been amazing for me.
Thank you, David. Oops, there was a hand and it disappeared before I could see it. Özlem.
Muted. You're muted. You're muted.
You are muted, Özlem.
Sorry, I turned the video on instead of the Right. So yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, Michael, I agree with you. I mean, I was referring to, in terms of the development of capitalism, the earlier eras, which, as you know, Ottoman Empire is a late gamer, and that's one of the reasons for the demise of the empire. And in terms of like these relationships, we know that Europe starts to colonize those parts of the world as well. So that because they become more successful in their, global capitalist colonial game, that ultimately would then the witnessing of the demise of the Ottoman Empire. And you have, as Meredith was saying earlier, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey at the time under the threat of being colonized by the European empires who were more successful in the capitalist game. But once they have their own nation states, especially in the case of Turkey, for example, mid-1940s, I mean, this is right around Cold War, that state capitalism turns into bourgeois capitalism developed by the Turkish state. So they aid and they create the emergence of a Turkish bourgeoisie along with, the landowners in Kurdistan. And you have this multiple processes of exploitation at the hands of different state-triggered capitalists. And so like the history of capitalism is very complicated, and obviously at some point it does turn into pure exploitation as well as the oppression. So it's not just political in that sense, especially after the 19th century. I was referring to more of the earlier eras. And I guess just very briefly in terms of the racialization, it always is the case, right? The racial discourses always accompanying the oppression and exploitation of peoples, that you have to give derogatory terms to them, you have to kind of, and in the case of the Ottoman Empire and even early Turkish history, that religion still continues to play a major factor, especially religious minorities are highly racialized, but then it affects the Kurds as well, along with a discourse of criminalization that starts as early as the early 20th century against the Kurds. I mean, even late 19th century against the Kurds. So like discourses of like bandits, and the unruly populations much before the emergence of the PKK, like a racialization and criminalization going hand in hand, used against the Kurds. So thank you.
Thank you, Islam. Benjamin, you're next.
Well, I just say something about Highland. It's funny, the organization I work for is called the Highland Support Project, and our focus is on Highland communities. And to know there's a whole lot of academic work over decades about the unique structure of Highlands, social structure. One guy that comes to mind is Luis Toasa. He's a professor in Ecuador, and he writes about the politics of altitude and the sort of social formations. Another thing to contemplate today is people historically have used the term banana republics. Nowadays, people are using the term mining republics. And one of the critical issues for 21st century indigenous peoples is that due to the global demand for minerals, as well as changes in mining technologies and transportation technologies, if you look at the history around the world, lots of times indigenous peoples from Vietnam to Appalachia, folks that did not necessarily have political economic power were driven into highland regions and became kind of a refuge. And so an issue we are facing right now is that these last refugees of peoples around the planet are now dead center in the crosshairs of the extraction industry. So no longer is there only agricultural extraction in a vertically integrated economies like Guatemala. Now you've got the mountain areas, leaving nowhere for people to go. Thanks.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to encourage the ones who haven't spoken yet. If you would like to share anything with us, please go ahead. Nick.
Thanks. For me, I noticed that my brain kind of stopped working, and I just feel like thinking about the people, the victims, and just standing still and being aware. So I think I feel like doing something creative or like something spiritual. So it just feels really good to be here and to have this discussion. But I'm not contributing because I feel this is for me more spiritual, emotional place at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Ran. Ranthropic.
There we go.
Okay, now we hear you.
There. Hi, everyone. My name's Ren. I didn't jump into the discussion because I didn't feel quite ready to articulate any particularly useful thoughts. But I really appreciate the discussion. I look forward to continuing the reading and hearing what everyone has to say, and hopefully having my mind a little more together to have some contributions to throw into the mix. So that's all for today.
Paul?
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. Silav, I'm actually calling from the U.S.-Mexico border, where we're giving support to our Haitian sisters and brothers who are being mistreated by the authorities. But this actually brings me to the question of Chiapas. This wasn't necessarily covered in the reading, but it's very interesting to see that the territory of Chiapas right now is host to a large number of the Haitian migrants who are leaving from South America going toward the United States. And I would be interested to know if people on this call have insight into given that the model of Chiapas and the model of Rojava are often, anti-state, stateless models, how the question of people coming in, or what we would call the migration question in North America, how the people and the authorities in the local legitimate authorities in Chiapas view this question of people who are non-indigenous, who might be from other cultures, who are coming in, and kind of the question that I wanted to put on the table.
Thank you, Paul. Arthur just shared some links in the chat window. I would like to talk about them a little bit. If you would like to get involved with ECR, Emergency Committee for Rojava, we have a website, defendrojava.org. We have a current campaign going on, actually. And also this reading group, which you are attending right now. We have an email list you can subscribe to, and we are represented also on all social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's @defendrojava. Just sharing that also verbally at this point. And Anya, I would like to pass it to you at this time with the questions we need to answer still.
I think there was just a couple of questions that we didn't answer right away. One was from Dave on other examples of directly democratic autonomous projects. And I think several people have brought up some examples already. And the other question was the current situation of Turkey's occupation of Rojava. Arthur, I wonder if you could give us a brief rundown. I think you follow the news more closely than I do. What's happening in Turkey's occupied regions?
Sure. I'll try to give just a brief overview, and I'm going to be doing it just like assuming that folks don't know a whole lot. So a lot of you may already know these things. But going back to 2018, the Turkish military invaded the northwestern corner of Syria, which was a historically predominantly Kurdish region called Afrin, and has been occupying that region since there's rampant abuse, kidnappings, torture, just about 200,000 to 300,000 people were displaced just from Afrin alone. Turkey occupies these areas in Rojava largely through proxy groups. So when you hear like the monikers TFSA, the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, or things like the Syrian National Army, these are sort of like umbrella groups of local militias that are directly paid and ordered by the Turkish military. Moving on from 2018, in 2019, a lot of people heard about Trump's kind of sudden move to withdraw US troops from northern Syria in October 2019. And there was another major operation by the Turkish government to invade and occupy other regions further east in Rojava, but still along the northern border of Syria with Turkey. And Turkey succeeded in seizing territory as far west as Tel Abyad, which in Kurdish is Gerispi, and as far east as Serkaniye, which is also called Ras Al-Ain in Arabic. And that is like the second. So if you look at a map, maybe somebody can share a map of kind of Rojava today, but there's Afrin, which is off in its own pocket, is a region occupied by Turkey, and then there's a strip along the border further east between those two cities. But since then, there was like a ceasefire and beyond kind of periodic skirmishes between the Syrian Democratic Forces, right, the self-defense forces of Rojava, and Turkey and Turkish-backed groups, the line hasn't really moved further south. And part of that is due to kind of US policy and stuff like that. The only other thing I want to mention is that it's important to keep in mind that the Turkish occupation of Kurdistan is not just happening within Rojava, but in Bashur, in the part of Kurdistan which is in Iraq. There's also ongoing Turkish attacks and occupation. I don't know if that was too much or too little, so sorry, I tried. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and Dave question if anyone wants to chime in other examples of similar struggles or international organizations bringing those different struggles together.
I think we're going to have time to discuss this later on during the next sessions.
Okay, you all come prepared.
Okay. Any other last minute comments, especially the ones who haven't spoken yet, if you would like to say something still?
Okay, sounds like a good moment to end. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. It was such a lively conversation, and we hope to see you at our next sessions.
And our next organizing meeting.
Oh, right. Arthur, do you want to pitch a call?
Always, you know it. Sorry, it's me again. October 7th, I believe, is our next organizing meeting, and that is the one which is open to all. So we welcome all of you to kind of put this history and theory into practice, and help us doing the work of standing up for Rojava, pushing for policies that will help them in trying to really build a grassroots movement to support them. So we have our campaign, Rojava Must Survive, and this is our next meeting, 7 p.m. Eastern on October 7th. We'll put it up soon on our calendar on our website, but for now you can kind of mark your calendars, and otherwise, yeah, follow those links and stay in touch. Thanks.
What time is the meeting? It's 7 p.m. Eastern time usually, Ariella. I see it in the chat.
Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you.
Good to see you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.